If your mother were the most powerful woman in the kingdom, would you believe she'd kill you to protect the throne? You're born into privilege. Your lineage traces back to the mightiest emperors of your nation. You are groomed for greatness, though raised far from your homeland. You are intelligent, perhaps awkward, but you have one purpose: to rule. Then, you finally ascend the throne. But within 6 months you're dead. No trial, no justice, no proper mourning. Whispers ripple through the gilded halls of the palace, and every whisper points to the same person: your own mother. This isn't fiction, this is history. This is the forgotten tragedy of Emperor Peter III of Russia, a monarch who ruled for just 186 days before his sudden and suspicious death. And the prime suspect behind the velvet curtain: his own mother-in-law, or perhaps even worse, his own mother. Tonight, we peel back layers of polished portraits, royal decrees, and carefully crafted myths to ask the question no textbook dares to answer. Was Peter III murdered by the very person who gave him life? And if so, was it personal or was it political? Because behind every throne is a shadow, and sometimes it wears the face of a mother. 18th century Europe was a battlefield of ideas, bloodlines, and ambitions. Monarchies were more than governments. They were family dynasties, obsessed with legacy, succession, and power. And nowhere was that more dramatic than in Imperial Russia. The Romanovs ruled a vast frozen empire, one that spanned 11 time zones and held millions under its iron grip. But behind the towering walls of the Winter Palace, family rivalries burned far hotter than the snow outside. Our story begins not in Russia but in a quiet German duchy, where a woman named Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp gave birth to a child that would one day become emperor. That child was Karl Peter Ulrich, later known to the world as Peter III. His life was shaped not by love, but by expectation, not by nurturing, but by manipulation. And standing behind him every step of the way was his mother, a woman whose ambitions extended far beyond the walls of their modest court. 6 months after becoming Emperor of Russia, Peter III died. Official reports claimed it was from colic or hemorrhoids, bizarre and vague for a man in his mid-30s, but those who saw his corpse whispered of bruises. Servants claimed to hear screams in the night, and one report said he was strangled with a scarf soaked in vinegar. Why would a mother want her son dead? The answer lies buried in decades of betrayal, cold alliances, and a throne built on blood. Because Johanna Elizabeth, though barely remembered today, was once one of the most powerful women in Europe. And when her son threatened everything she worked for, eliminating him may have seemed like the only way to preserve her legacy. In the chapters that follow, we'll uncover the complicated childhood of Peter III, abandoned, awkward, and emotionally isolated, his strained relationship with his mother and her dark political entanglements, his marriage to Catherine the Great, a union that would become a slow-burning coup, the rise of palace conspiracies, midnight plots, and whispered betrayals, the chilling events of his final days, and the questions historians still debate today. Is this the tale of a weak ruler overtaken by a brilliant wife? Or is it something darker, slow, silent, matricide, born of politics, pride, and cold royal calculation? Let's step into the frostbitten corridors of Russian power, where love was a mask, and the sharpest knives came from behind. If tragedy begins in the cradle, then Peter III's story was written in shadows long before his coronation. He was born Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp on February 21, 1728, in the modest duchy of Kiel, present-day Germany. His mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was a woman of noble blood, but minor status. She married Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp, a man twice her age, more interested in politics than passion. Their union was strategic, not romantic. From the moment Peter was born, Johanna saw him not as a son but as a key that could unlock royal doors across Europe, a key that could elevate her status from duchess to something far grander. But fate had other plans. Just 11 years into Peter's life, his father died suddenly, leaving him an orphan in name, though not in presence. His mother, ambitious and calculating, saw opportunity in the tragedy. Instead of mourning, she began maneuvering her target: the Romanov dynasty. You see, Peter wasn't just a forgotten German boy. He had Russian blood. His mother's grandmother was a sister of Peter the Great, making young Peter a distant heir to the Russian throne. At the time, the Russian Empire was under the rule of Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Elizabeth had no children, no heir, and so Johanna, ever the strategist, began grooming Peter for something far greater than a quiet life in Kiel. She dreamed of palaces, power, and proximity to a crown that once seemed out of reach. In 1742, her ambitions bore fruit. Elizabeth, desperate for a successor to continue the Romanov line, summoned Peter to St. Petersburg. He was just 14 years old. He didn't speak Russian, he had no friends, and within days of arriving, he was forcibly converted to Russian Orthodoxy, stripped of his German name, and reborn as Pyotr Fyodorovich Peter of Russia. Curiously, Johanna was not invited to stay in the Russian court. Despite having orchestrated her son's ascent, Elizabeth distrusted her deeply. There were rumors of espionage, of letters sent to Prussian enemies, and of Johanna overstepping her bounds. It didn't help that Johanna despised Russian culture, and let her disgust show in subtle insults and disdainful etiquette. Within months, she was quietly expelled from Russia. No scandal, no trial, just a whispered goodbye. But her departure left a void in Peter's life, one that would shape his emotional landscape forever. He had been torn from his homeland, his name had been erased, his mother, the only constant in his life, was now gone. In the vast and frozen courts of Russia, Peter became a boy without a country, a prince without a family, a pawn without a player. And yet, he was now second in line to the throne of one of the most powerful empires in the world. Peter was not the kind of prince poets wrote about. He was tall, thin, and awkward. His eyes were distant. His interests were peculiar. He had a deep obsession with Prussian military discipline, even playing with toy soldiers well into his 20s. He often drank heavily, even as a teenager, and showed signs of emotional immaturity and social withdrawal. Those around him mocked his eccentricities. They whispered that he was mad, childish, and unfit for command. But what they didn't see was the deep loneliness gnawing at him. He was a stranger in a strange land, raised without affection, and taught that his only value lay in obedience and appearance. He longed for approval. He longed for connection. And most of all, he longed for the love of a mother who had vanished into the cold. Peter III grew up with a crown in sight but warmth out of reach. While Peter adjusted clumsily to Russian court life, Johanna Elizabeth was not idle. Even from afar, she continued orchestrating her ambitions. Her next move was even bolder. She convinced Empress Elizabeth to consider her daughter, Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst-Peter's Kuznets, a bride for the future emperor. In 1745, the marriage was approved. Sophie would become Catherine, and Peter would become the reluctant groom. Johanna had now planted both of her children into the Romanov line, one as heir, the other as empress-to-be. But this was no fairy tale. It was a slow-burn trap, because the seeds of this marriage would one day bloom into a coup and possibly an assassination. Johanna may have left Russia, but her fingerprints were everywhere, on the throne, on the bride, and perhaps on the bottle of poison that would take Peter's life. They were wed to unify an empire, but lived as strangers under the same golden roof. And when the crown came between them, one would rise and the other would fall. By all appearances, their wedding was a triumph of diplomacy. In 1745, Peter, heir to the Russian Empire, married a 16-year-old German princess named Sophie Friedrich, August of Anhalt. Upon her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, she took the name Catherine Alexeyevna. History would remember her as Catherine the Great, but, at that moment, she was simply a girl married to a boy she hardly knew, a boy who would one day become her greatest enemy. The marriage wasn't built on love, it was a political calculation, arranged by Empress Elizabeth and influenced once again by Johanna Elizabeth, Catherine's mother. Peter and Catherine were cousins, both of German descent, and both viewed as outsiders within the Russian court. The hope was that, together, they would form a strong dynastic unit to solidify the Romanov line. But behind palace walls, it quickly became clear. This was not a union, it was a quiet war. Peter, just 17 at the time of the wedding, was emotionally stunted and socially inept. He was obsessed with military toys, often playing with tin soldiers late into the night, sometimes making Catherine march them with him in his chambers. He also had a bizarre admiration for Frederick the Great of Prussia, a rival to Russia and a political threat. He openly wore Prussian military uniforms, spoke German more than Russian, and mocked Orthodox rituals, earning the disdain of Russian courtiers. To Catherine, Peter was not only immature, but dangerously unfit for rule. He humiliated her in public. He made jokes about her appearance. He often ignored her for long stretches, even sleeping with other women in their shared palace. In her memoirs, Catherine described her early marriage as a prison of cold silence, one where she was neither wife, nor mistress, nor confidant. But Catherine was no victim. She was brilliant, multilingual, politically savvy, and quickly realized that if she wanted to survive the Russian court, she would have to play a different game. She began cultivating relationships not just romantically, but strategically. She befriended ministers, officers, and foreign ambassadors. She converted fully to Russian Orthodoxy and embraced Russian culture more passionately than her husband ever did. While Peter mocked the empire, Catherine became its daughter, and while Peter sank deeper into drunkenness and paranoia, Catherine built her own silent alliance. Some say she took love as powerful men who would later support her rise, but her greatest act of rebellion was not in the bedroom, it was in the mind. Catherine was quietly learning how to become empress long before the throne was ever empty. In 1761, everything changed. Empress Elizabeth died, and Peter III, after decades in waiting, finally ascended the Russian throne. He was 33, Catherine was 32, but the Peter who took the crown was not the boy Catherine had married, he was worse. Within days of becoming emperor, he began enacting reforms that shocked the empire. He withdrew Russian troops from the 7 Years' War. He made a peace treaty with Prussia, a hated enemy. He issued decrees that stripped power from the church and nobility. He even planned to divorce Catherine and to legitimize his mistress's children. The court was horrified. The clergy was enraged. And the army, the lifeblood of the empire, began to murmur rebellion. Peter had worn the crown for just weeks, but already The cracks were showing, and in the shadows, Catherine saw her moment approaching. A wife turns revolutionary. For years, Catherine had suffered in silence. Now, she began to move. She met secretly with loyal guards. She secured promises from military officers. And most chilling of all, she began discussing the possibility of a coup, not to be empress, but to save Russia, she claimed, from a madman wearing a crown. On July 9, 1762, Peter III left the capital for a brief retreat outside St. Petersburg. While he slept, Catherine made her move. She appeared in full military uniform at the Ismailovsky Regiment barracks. The soldiers swore loyalty to her. She rode to the Senate, declared herself sole ruler of Russia, and was met with cheers instead of resistance. By the time Peter awoke the next morning, he was no longer emperor. The final act of the marriage, Peter was arrested, brought to a remote palace, and kept under guard. He was confused, hurt, bitter. He begged for mercy. He offered to abdicate peacefully. He even wrote a letter asking to live quietly in exile. But Catherine never responded, and just 8 days after the coup, Peter was dead. The official cause, but the rumors told another story. He had been strangled, or poisoned, or beaten by guards accidentally. And though Catherine claimed no knowledge of his death, many believed it was not just a political killing but a final act in a toxic marriage that had become a battlefield. One ruled with steel, the other died in silence. Their marriage ended the way it had lived, not in love but in betrayal. He was emperor for 186 days. He died 8 days after his downfall. No one mourned. No one asked questions. But centuries later, the silence around his death is louder than any confession. On July 9, 1762, Peter III was emperor. By July 10th, he was a prisoner. By July 17th, he was dead. Never before had the transfer of power in Imperial Russia been so swift or so silent. Catherine's coup was a masterpiece of precision. There was no public violence, no mass execution, no civil unrest. The army once Peter's undeclared for Catherine without firing a shot. Church leaders blessed her rule. The nobility, frightened of Peter's erratic reforms, breathed a sigh of relief. And as for Peter, he was shuttled to Rubsha, a secluded estate outside the city, where he spent his last days under guard, stripped of his crown and his dignity. What happened during those final days? Historians disagree. There are no diaries, no witnesses who spoke freely, only vague reports and chilling rumors. Some say Peter begged to speak with Catherine. He wrote her a letter offering full abdication. He requested to live quietly in Denmark or return to his German homeland. She never replied. Instead, she sent him food and drink. Guards watched him around the clock. One of those guards was Alexei Orlov, brother to Gregory Orlov, Catherine's most powerful lover and co-conspirator. It is Alexei who would later be accused, though never officially charged, of delivering Peter's death. On July 17, 1762, an announcement was made. Peter III had died of hemorrhoidal colic and a sudden apoplectic attack. The court published this version widely, hoping the odd language would confuse more than clarify. No funeral, no body displayed, no autopsy, and within days Peter's name was erased from state documents and religious services. It was as if he had never ruled, but the silence only deepened suspicion. Foreign ambassadors, especially from Prussia, immediately suspected murder. One reported hearing screams from Peter's quarters the night before his death. Another claimed that Tsar had been strangled in a drunken scuffle with his guards. The people were confused but not outraged. Peter had never been loved, and Catherine cleverly cast herself as the savior of Russia from an unstable ruler. The empire moved on, but history never forgot. The murder theory. So, was Peter III murdered? Let's examine the most widely accepted theory among modern historians. On July 17th, Alexei Orlov and several guards entered Peter's chamber. A drunken altercation ensued, whether staged or genuine, we don't know. Peter was either strangled with a scarf or beaten until he collapsed. His body, according to one source, had bruises around the neck and face. No official autopsy was performed. No one was ever tried or punished. When Catherine was later questioned by foreign envoys, she simply shrugged, saying Peter had always been sickly. And just like that, an emperor was erased not just from power, but from memory. Some argue Catherine didn't order Peter's death, but she didn't stop it either. It's possible Alexei Orlov and his men took initiative, fearing that leaving Peter alive posed a greater threat. As long as Peter lived, he was a symbol to rally behind. And with Catherine's throne still fresh and fragile, the existence of a living ex-emperor was a dangerous liability. In that sense, Peter's death was not personal, it was political necessity. But whether she signed the order or silently allowed it, Catherine benefited most from Peter's death. And that fact alone casts a long shadow. The aftermath: Catherine never spoke publicly of Peter again. His name was banned from Orthodox liturgy. His reign was marked as an interregnum, a gap between real rulers. She began her own propaganda campaign, casting Peter as a drunken fool, a Prussian puppet, and an unfit sovereign. In private, she may have felt guilt or nothing at all. Her focus shifted quickly to consolidating power, reforming law, expanding the empire, and becoming the greatest ruler Russia had ever seen. But behind that greatness lay a man she had once called husband, a man who might have been a weak king but who died not as a tyrant, not even as a traitor, but as a man too naive to survive a throne built on betrayal. Peter III ruled for 186 days. He died at 34. No grave bears his name. No monument honors his reign. But the silence around his death may be the loudest cry for justice history has ever heard. History is written by the victors. But what if the vanquished had lived? What kind of empire would Russia have become under Peter III? When Peter III died in July 1762, the world did not pause. Russia moved forward under Empress Catherine II, and history quickly turned its spotlight to her ambitious reforms and military conquests. But beneath the layers of legacy and legend, a haunting question remains. What if Peter had survived? What kind of emperor would he have become? Would Russia have flourished or fallen? Let's explore the alternate world, one where Peter lived to rule, though often dismissed as immature or incompetent. Peter III did have a clear political agenda. It was revolutionary in its own way. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, not just as a military leader, but as a reformer. Peter dreamed of transforming Russia into a modern European state, modeled on Prussian efficiency, law, and Enlightenment ideals. Had he lived, Peter would likely have pursued the following reforms: end Russia's involvement in the 7 Years' War, which he actually did in his short reign; form a lasting alliance with Prussia, reshaping European diplomacy; modernize the Russian army, using Prussian tactics and structure; reduce the power of the Orthodox Church, bringing religious institutions under state control; abolish certain feudal practices, potentially freeing serfs and empowering commoners. These weren't the ramblings of a madman. They were dangerous ideas, and not because they were wrong, but because they threatened the deep-rooted power of Russian nobility. Peter may have lacked tact, but he had vision, one that might have made Russia more modern, more Western, and far less autocratic. If Peter had lived and ruled, Russia may have avoided costly wars against the Ottoman Empire, harsh crackdowns on dissent that Catherine later enforced, over centralized power in the monarchy. His alliance with Prussia might have prevented future wars in Eastern Europe. He may have implemented legal reforms long before Catherine did, though perhaps more clumsily. His approach would have been controversial, even unpopular, but it could have ushered in constitutional-style governance decades before it arrived elsewhere in Russia. Instead of becoming an empire of expansion, Russia might have become a state of stability and structure. One of the most profound changes in this alternate timeline would be Catherine herself. If Peter had survived and held power, she likely would have been divorced and exiled, or perhaps sent to a convent. Her influence on Russia would have been erased from history. There would have been no Catherine the Great, no golden age of territorial expansion, no educational reforms under her name, no conquest of Crimea. But would that have been a loss? Catherine's reign, though magnificent in scale, also brought tighter autocracy, military domination, and harsh class divisions. Peter's rule, though clumsy and unpopular, might have avoided the bloodshed and suppression that marked much of Catherine's legacy. It's possible the Russian people would have had more freedom, but less glory. Peter III did father a child, Paul I, who eventually became emperor decades later. But Paul grew up haunted by whispers that his mother had killed his father, that he was the son of a weak man and the heir to a stolen throne. Paul's reign was short and filled with paranoia. He banned all female succession, a direct reaction to his mother's rule, and he spent much of his life trying to rehabilitate Peter's image, even building monuments in his name. But the damage had already been done. Peter was dead, and his son ruled in shadows and fear. Had Peter lived, Paul may have grown up with confidence, mentorship, and stability, becoming the monarch Peter never got to be. In the world we know, Peter III is a footnote, a joke in textbooks, a tragic husband, a drunken fool replaced by a titan of history. But in the world that could have been, he might have ended serfdom early. He might have brought European philosophy to Russian governance. He might have shared power instead of hoarding it. He might have left behind a stable constitution instead of a bloody legacy of coups and assassinations. Yes, he was flawed. Yes, he was awkward. But history has shown us that many great reformers were unpopular in their time. Peter III may not have been a great emperor, but he might have been a good one, and that might have made all the difference. So what if Peter had lived? Would we still call Catherine great? Would Russia be smaller, but freer? Would a peaceful emperor have changed the world more than a conquering one? History doesn't answer those questions. It only reminds us that power is not always taken with violence. Sometimes, it's lost in silence. History laughed at him. His wife erased him. His mother may have killed him. But the truth, like a ghost in the palace, refuses to die. How should we remember Peter III of Russia? He ruled for only 186 days. He left behind no great wars, no stunning architecture, no heroic portraits astride horses. Even his legacy as a father is overshadowed by the psychological damage his death inflicted on his only son. Paul, to many, he's a punchline. To others, a forgotten man in the shadow of Catherine the Great. But as we look deeper, a more complex figure emerges, one who deserves more than ridicule or silence. So, let's return to the question. Was Peter III a fool, a reformer, or a martyr? Was he a fool? Much of the posthumous image of Peter comes from Catherine herself. After the coup, she wasted no time crafting a caricature of her late husband, a man obsessed with toy soldiers, a social misfit who preferred drinking alone to leading his empire, a traitor who admired Prussia more than Russia, a man so immature he would bark orders at palace dogs. And yes, some of it was true. Peter lacked political finesse. He mocked orthodox traditions in a deeply religious court. He surrounded himself with German advisors who alienated the Russian elite. He openly expressed admiration for Frederick the Great, Russia's enemy during the 7 Years' War. But being odd is not the same as being incompetent, and many of the so-called foolish traits may have been exaggerated or weaponized to justify his removal. A clumsy ruler, maybe, but a fool, that may be history's laziest verdict. Was he a reformer? Here's where things get interesting. In just 6 months, Peter introduced over 200 decrees radical for that time. He ended Russia's war with Prussia, returning land without bloodshed. He abolished the secret police, a tool of fear under his predecessors. He granted religious freedom to non-Orthodox citizens. He banned church property from expanding, limiting clerical power. He planned to abolish serfdom, the feudal system that chained millions to landowners. For a man so often called weak, his legislative vision was bold. And while Catherine later adopted many of these ideas, it's important to note, Peter did it first. He just didn't have time or the support to finish. Historians now reconsider Peter not as a clown prince, but as a proto-Enlightenment monarch, a man who saw where Russia needed to go, but lacked the charisma or political machine to get it there. Was he a martyr? Let's not forget how Peter died. He was overthrown by his own wife, detained without trial, killed under mysterious circumstances. His death was followed by no investigation, no inquiry, no justice. If that isn't the definition of a political martyr, then what is? And if we look deeper, we see a man caught in a web of dynastic ambition, noble resentment, foreign distrust, and personal betrayal. He was a foreigner in a Russian court, a reformer in a reactionary empire, a husband to a woman building a revolution behind his back, a son to a mother who may have viewed him as a pawn or a threat. Peter wasn't just removed from the throne, he was erased from the narrative, an early victim of imperial propaganda. And in that silence, his humanity disappeared. What historians say today, modern historians have begun re-evaluating Peter III, especially as new letters, documents, and foreign accounts emerge. Some see him as a tragic intellectual, better suited for philosophy than politics, a liberalizer who came too soon for the autocratic Russian system, a cautionary tale of what happens when you reform without allies, a tragic victim of history written by the victor Catherine the Great. Others are more critical, arguing that his erratic behavior and cultural detachment still made him unfit to rule. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Peter was no saint, but he may have been the last idealist to wear the Russian crown. Why Peter still matters in today's world of historical revision. Peter III stands as a reminder that the losers of history are not always the villains, that power can be stolen with smiles and silence, that a man erased may still leave behind a shadow too long to ignore. His story forces us to question the comfortable myths we inherit. It asks, who writes history, and for whom? Peter's tragedy is not just that he died, it's that we stopped asking why. Final verdict, so what was he? A fool. Only if judged by the court that mocked him. A reformer, certainly, though flawed. A martyr, perhaps not to a cause, but to a system that feared change more than failure. Peter III was all of these, and none of them. But one thing is clear. He was a king killed not by sword or battlefield, but by silence, shame, and betrayal from those closest to him. And that makes him one of the most tragic monarchs history has ever tried to forget. She gave birth to an emperor, but history barely speaks her name. Yet behind Peter's short life and violent death stands a figure cloaked in silence, ambition, and secrets. His mother, and most accounts of Peter III's downfall. One name is either completely absent or shrouded in suspicion. Johanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp. She was his mother, his first protector, and, some believe, his first betrayer. Was she the mastermind behind his rise, or the silent architect of his fall? In this chapter, we lift the curtain on a woman whose fingerprints may be found all over the bloodied pages of Russian history if you know where to look. A duchess with a king's ambition, Johanna Elizabeth was born into minor German nobility in 1712. She married Christian August of Holstein-Gottorp, a quiet older man who offered her title but little attention. Their son, Karl Peter Ulrich, later Peter III, was the vessel for every dream Johanna ever had. From the beginning, she raised him not as a boy but as a future king. She was ambitious, intelligent, and politically savvy, perhaps even more so than her son would ever become. After her husband's death in 1739, Johanna became the sole architect of Peter's future, lobbying tirelessly to align her son with greater courts, wealthier bloodlines, and one very specific empire, Russia. The grand plan. Russia. Johanna's great political breakthrough came when she successfully caught the attention of Empress Elizabeth of Russia. Why? Because Johanna's family, though small, was connected by blood to Peter the Great. Her son Peter was a legitimate Romanov descendant. At the time, Empress Elizabeth had no children. She needed an heir, and Johanna offered one. In 1742, young Peter was summoned to Russia hand. Johanna accompanied him. Her influence at court was swift, bold, and to song too aggressive. She tried to control introductions. She pushed her son to curry favor. She attempted to negotiate her own place in the Russian hierarchy, but in doing so, she made powerful enemies. Exiled from court within just a few months of arriving in St. Petersburg, Johanna had crossed a line. Empress Elizabeth began to see her as a threat, not an ally. There were whispers of espionage that Johanna had sent private letters to Prussian rulers, revealing details of the Russian court. There were rumors she was manipulating her son, and even spying on Elizabeth's private conversations. The Empress acted swiftly. Johanna was banished from court under the cover of illness. She returned to Germany in disgrace, but Peter remained. From that moment on, mother and son would never live together again. But Johanna's influence didn't vanish, it simply went underground. The second move, a royal marriage, even in exile, Johanna kept scheming. Her daughter, Sophie of Hohenzollern, was beautiful, bright and unwed. So Johanna wrote letters, many letters, convincing Empress Elizabeth that Sophie would make a perfect bride for young Peter. In 1745, the plan succeeded. Sophie traveled to Russia, converted to Orthodoxy, took the name Catherine, and married Peter. Johanna had now placed both her children at the heart of Russian power. She may have been exiled physically, but politically she was still in the rumor ghost in the palace corridors. A mother's absence or approval. Here's where history grows cold and suspicious. When Peter III was overthrown and later died, Johanna was nowhere near St. Petersburg, but her silence was deafening. There are no records of her speaking out, no letters of protest, no public mourning. Some believe that she may have approved of Catherine's coup, having long lost faith in Peter's leadership. Others suggest that her early abandonment left Peter emotionally defenseless, vulnerable to manipulation, and desperate for love from anyone, even his enemies. Johanna may not have wielded the dagger, but she may have put it into someone's hand. The poison theory. And now, the most chilling question. Did Johanna directly or indirectly participate in Peter's death? There is no conclusive evidence, only patterns, whispers, and eerie timing. She never visited Peter after his downfall. She maintained contact with Prussian agents, some of whom benefited from Peter's removal. She had long believed that Catherine was the more capable child, and perhaps most crucially, she vanished from historical records shortly after Peter's death. Some historians argue she died in emotional collapse. Others believe she was silenced, paid off, or retreated into voluntary obscurity to avoid scandal. Whatever the truth, the woman who fought so hard to crown her son never defended his memory, and perhaps that silence says more than words ever could. The forgotten queenmaker Johanna Elizabeth is rarely taught in schools. She has no statues, no biography in most languages, no place in Russia's national memory. But behind, a boy king too young to fight back, a queen who rose in his place, and a coup that changed history. There was a mother who pushed the first domino. She was not a villain, nor a hero, but a woman born into a world where power was only inherited, and so she built it through her children. She may not have worn the crown, but she designed it. She didn't just take the throne. She rewrote the story of how she got there. And in doing so, Catherine the Great buried her husband in more than just a grave. When Catherine II seized the throne of Russia in 1762, she didn't just overthrow an emperor, she overthrew a narrative, a memory, and a man. Peter III, in life, had been an awkward monarch, but in death, he became something else, a political inconvenience. To ensure her reign would last, Catherine had to do more than rule. She had to control how history remembered her husband, and she did that not through bloodshed but through paper, ink, and silence. The first step: erase his name. Within days of Peter's death, his name vanished from official state records. His 186-day reign was rebranded as an interim or transition. Church services ceased praying for his soul, an honor even disgraced rulers typically received. State publications removed his image from coins, proclamations, and ceremonial documents. No public mourning was declared. No memorial was built. No funeral procession honored the Emperor of Russia. It was as if Peter III had never existed. The official story: a madman saved us. Catherine immediately set out to justify her coup, not as ambition but as necessity. Through carefully crafted proclamations and rumors whispered in palace halls, the message was clear. Peter was mentally unstable. He was a traitor, loyal to Prussia, not Russia. He planned to dismantle the church, abolish the army, and give away Russian land. Much of this was either exaggerated or outright false, but it didn't matter. Catherine's regime published pamphlets, speeches, and editorials painting Peter as un-Russian, immature, dangerously erratic, unworthy of the crown. She told officials he had planned to divorce her, disinherit their son, and crown his mistress's children instead. There was no trial, no evidence, but the people, eager for stability, believed her. After all, it's easy to rewrite history when your pen is dipped in imperial ink. Playing the Empress of the People, Catherine didn't just tear down Peter's image, she built herself up in its place. She positioned herself as the daughter Russia never had, a champion of orthodoxy and tradition, a defender of the army and nobility, a ruler who would restore dignity to the throne Peter had defiled. In speeches, she referred to Peter as a dangerous experiment, and to herself as the natural guardian of Russian values. She began issuing reforms Peter had already started, but under her own name, and with greater political skill. She became the enlightened empress, while Peter was remembered only as a footnote or a farce. The memoirs, history by her hand, perhaps the greatest propaganda Catherine ever wrote, was her own. In her famous memoirs, penned in later life and widely circulated, she portrays Peter as a drunk, a fool, a man obsessed with playing with toy soldiers, a husband who never loved her and sought to ruin her. She frames her coup as heroic, her governance as divinely inspired, and Peter's death as inevitable. Yet historians have noted troubling inconsistencies. Her accounts of Peter's cruelty lack witnesses, her timelines contradict official records, her reluctance to take the throne clashes with how swiftly she acted, even more revealing. Her memoirs never discuss Peter's death in any detail. The truth wasn't just rewritten, it was strategically left out. Controlling memory equals controlling power. Why did Catherine go to such lengths to erase Peter's legacy? Because she understood something that dictators, emperors, and modern rulers have all learned. Power is not just taken, it must be justified. And the best way to justify a coup is to claim the person you overthrew deserved it. Catherine's control of Peter's narrative ensured no sympathy would rise for him. No uprisings would form around his memory. No claims to the throne from Peter's allies would gain traction by destroying his reputation. She eliminated the need for further bloodshed. The pen, in her hands, was deadlier than any sword. Generations affected Peter's son, Paul. I grew up in the shadow of a father everyone mocked, but no one dared speak of. He became paranoid, obsessed with justice, and eventually passed laws to prevent women from inheriting the throne. Again, a direct response to Catherine: rehabilitate Peter's name, building monuments and declaring his reign legitimate. But the damage was done. By then, Catherine's version of history had become the official one. The lesson in propaganda: Peter III wasn't just overthrown, he was outwritten. His story reminds us that history is not always about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story afterward. And Catherine was the greatest storyteller the Romanovs ever had. She buried his body. She buried his legacy. But decades later, the empire she ruled tried to bring him back, not to life, but to justice. Peter III died in silence. No royal funeral, no monument, no songs of sorrow, but his ghost didn't vanish. It lingered in palace corridors, in whispered doubts in the eyes of his son. Because even though Catherine the Great had erased Peter from history, she couldn't erase blood. And when Paul I, their only child, took the throne in 1796, he was ready to dig up everything his mother had buried. A son with a mission, Paul I was 42 when he became emperor. He had waited his entire life, longer than his father ruled, for that moment. And when he finally wore the crown, he didn't begin with proclamations of expansion or conquest. He began with vengeance, not for himself, but for his father. In the first days of his reign, Paul made a declaration that shocked the Russian court. He would give Peter III a royal burial, 34 years after his death. The funeral that never was. Paul ordered that Peter's remains be exhumed from their quiet resting place in the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. He had the coffin cleaned, the body redressed, and brought to St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, the traditional burial site of Russian emperors. And there, in full military procession, Peter III was finally buried as a Tsar. Thousands lined the streets, bells rang, guns fired in salute. But the most shocking part: Catherine was there too. Rather, her body was. Paul had her coffin removed from its imperial tomb, placed side by side with Peter's, and forced her corpse to attend his funeral. It was symbolic. It was theatrical. It was a reckoning. And it was only the beginning. Rewriting the rewrite, Paul did more than rebury Peter. He began to restore his father's reputation. He issued decrees, recognizing Peter's 186-day reign as legitimate, declaring his death unjust, and his legacy wrongfully erased, reintroducing Peter's face on official medals and emblems. He even had statues and busts made of Peter, long forbidden during Catherine's rule. In court speeches, Paul referred to his father as the light denied a place in history, the first true reformer of our time. The emperor silenced too soon for a brief time. It looked like Peter III would finally get the legacy he never had. A court divided, but Paul's obsession with restoring his father came at a cost. Many nobles who had served under Catherine were furious. They had helped erase Peter. Now they were being asked to praise him. Some whispered that Paul's grief had turned into madness. Others feared he would punish Catherine's old allies, many of whom had a direct hand in Peter's coup. And Paul did act harshly. He exiled some of Catherine's closest advisors. He reversed several of her policies. He threatened to investigate Peter's death even decades later, but his fury only bred enemies. And just 5 years after becoming emperor, Paul I was assassinated in a palace coup, possibly orchestrated by the very nobles his mother once empowered. the ghost that lived on after Paul's death. His son Alexander I became emperor. Unlike his father, Alexander sought peace and pragmatism. He did not continue the campaign to restore Peter's image, but he didn't suppress it either. Peter Ihe's name remained in the imperial record. His coffin stayed beside Catherine's. His busts remained in select halls, but his story remained quiet. Not until the 20th century would his legacy be re-examined with honesty. Historians reopened the case as Russian history entered the age of archives, skepticism, and academic rigor. Scholars began looking at Peter III without Catherine's shadow, and they found a man with reformist instincts, a ruler who passed more liberal decrees in 6 months than some did in decades, a monarch who tried to end war, empower people, and modernize the state. They also found that most accounts of Peter's madness came from Catherine's memoirs or her allies, that the official cause of death, colic, was suspiciously vague, that Catherine had every political motive to eliminate him. In time, the scholarly consensus shifted. Peter was not a tyrant, not a traitor, but perhaps the most tragic reformer Russia ever knew. A posthumous justice today, in the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Peter III's tomb sits quietly beside Catherine the Great's. Tourists walk past without knowing the irony that one of these rulers died by betrayal, and the other built her legend on that silence. But the fact that they lie side by side is perhaps history's most poetic judgment. She couldn't outrun his name, and he couldn't rise without hers. 2 lives, 1 crown, bound forever in death. Not all kings are remembered. Some are erased, and some, like Peter III, become the haunting question at the heart of an empire. What if? He ruled for 186 days. He died in 8. He was buried in silence, and for centuries, he was remembered only as a mistake. Yet now, as we look back over the long arc of Russian history, Peter III refuses to stay in the shadows, not because he conquered, not because he inspired, but because he reveals something deeper about the way history chooses its heroes. The misunderstood monarch. Peter was awkward, yes, naive, perhaps, poorly suited for palace intrigue, undoubtedly. But he was also the first Russian monarch to propose abolishing of them, a believer in religious freedom, a man who ended a war, not started one, a leader who sought peace with his enemies, even at political risk, a son whose mother abandoned him, a husband whose wife overthrew him, a king whose story was rewritten before it could be told. In a time of emperors who ruled with iron and fire, Peter III tried to lead with reason and reform, and he paid for it with his life. Power versus principle. His downfall reminds us that good intentions are not enough in politics. In a court dominated by power brokers, generals, and schemers, Peter was a reformer who lacked the instinct to survive. He was not ruthless, he was not strategic, and in Catherine's court, those flaws were fatal. Ironically, many of the reforms Peter proposed, religious tolerance, legal modernization, limits on church wealth, were later celebrated under other rulers. He was punished not for what he did wrong, but for what he tried to do too soon. The mirror of memory. Peter III is not just a figure of the past, he's a reflection of a broader truth. That history is not objective, it is edited, it is curated, it is often told by the very people who benefited from someone else's silence. How many other Peters have been buried quietly? How many voices have we lost to the powerful pens of victors? Catherine was a great empress, but her greatness came, in part, by erasing the man who came before her. And while she built an empire of conquest, Peter's vision, however clumsy, was built on conscience. What we can learn today in today's world, where narratives are still shaped by media, politics, and power, Peter's story remains profoundly relevant. He reminds us that truth can be buried but not forever, that reformers may not live to see their legacies, but their ideas can survive them, that being forgotten is not the same as being unworthy. He reminds us to question the official story, to wonder who got left out of the textbooks, and to recognize that sometimes, the real heroes of history never wore a crown in peace. The tomb beside the Queen today. If you walk into the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, you'll see the tombs of Russia's greatest monarchs. Amid the grandeur and marble, you'll find 2 stone coffins side by side. Catherine II, Empress of Enlightenment, and Peter III, the king she erased, then was forced to lie beside in death. There is no plaque to explain their story, no sign to say that one may have killed the other, but there they rest, for all eternity, partners in blood, power, and myth. And perhaps, in that silence, Peter finally got the last word. Final words. So what do we make of Peter III? Was he a failure? Not entirely. A reformer? Certainly. A martyr, in a way, forgotten for far too long, but not anymore. With each book, each documentary, each new re-examination, Peter is returning not as a fool, not as a tyrant, but as a man who dared to rule differently, and was destroyed for it. He was not the king Russia wanted. He may not even have been the king it needed, but he was the king who tried. And in the end, that may be the most human kind of greatness there is.